I'm joined by research fellow. It's Ross Harvey from the South African Institute for International Affairs. Ross, good evening to you. Thank you very much indeed for your time. This evening, it is not the number of carcasses that we're finding in Botswana. Some are suggesting it's close to 1,800. It's researchers, Ross, who are saying 90% of them are confirmed as poached. Is that what you're hearing?
Yeah. So, Gareth, thanks for having me on the show. The carcass count is not necessarily a matter of concern. What is of concern is whether there's evidence of poaching in the fresh or recent carcasses. So if you combine those two categories, then carcasses that have evidence of having been poached in the last year or so, 80% of those, 33 fresh and 81% of the other 79 considered recent, i.e. within a year of the survey, are confirmed as poached. And if you have a total carcass ratio, in other words, number of carcasses to overall population of more than 8%, then the science suggests that that is evidence of a population in decline. And that's what we have in northern Botswana from the most comprehensive aerial survey that's ever been done of Botswana's elephants.
We're going to talk about that aerial survey, and as far as Botswana's anti-poaching efforts are concerned. Ross, help me understand, why is this concerning now? Just put the numbers into context for me. Are we seeing, when we say a spike, some people think it's 50%. Is it year on year? Is it significantly higher? Help me understand why there's now a concern around it.
Good question. So in 2014 and 2015, Dr. Mike Chase of Elephants Without Borders flew the Great Elephant Census across the continent, and they estimated about 415,000 savanna elephants across the continent, with about 137,000 in Botswana, which, you know, you run the numbers, that's over a quarter of the continent's savanna elephant population in one country. At the time, 2014, there was no evidence of poaching in Botswana. Of all the carcasses that were inspected, none of them had evidence of having been poached. This time around, a serious spike. We're talking about 90 carcasses within the space of 1,000 square kilometers that have evidence of having been poached. That means you can literally see that the skull has been axed or chopped, or the poachers have moved brush or bush over the carcasses to try and hide the evidence of poaching. And of course, those figures are disputed, because it brings into sharp relief that, well, Botswana has now a problem which has been predicted for a long time. And it was predicted in 2015 precisely because of the numbers. There's density within and there's scarcity without. And that means that the poaching pressure was always going to move south. But the concern from a scientific perspective is literally that even though the population has remained relatively static between 2014 and 2018, we are seeing a very high carcass count in comparison to past surveys. And like I said, the last one was done 4 years prior to this one. So we're not talking about year on year. We're talking about the first bit of comprehensive scientific evidence that we've had since 2014, and it shows a spike.
So help me understand, Ross, if this is the case where in a situation where you're trying to increase the numbers of elephants through preservation and population growth in a certain biome, it's now sounding to me, and maybe I've misunderstood, it now sounds like the successes of the breeding programs of elephants is so successful it's led to their decline. Or is that an overcritical way of looking at it?
No, I think that there's a measure of truth to that, Gareth. There's a matter both of internal growth, but there's also a matter of elephants, because they're a migratory species and highly intelligent, having moved from other parts of the region. Elephants don't like being hunted and they don't like being poached, so they move to where it's safe. And then they breed where it's safe as well, and they literally creche their babies. And if they need nutrition elsewhere, then they do a recce. They're incredibly smart species. So we are finding that, in a sense, Botswana, you could say, has been a victim of its own success, in that poaching elsewhere has led to external in-migration, and there's also been organic breeding from within. And that's, from a conservation perspective, that's great for Botswana. Just, there is controversy around this as to whether the country has exceeded its carrying capacity. But I'm of the view that the science doesn't bear that out. And nature adapts if you keep the landscapes intact. But yeah, it was always going to become more difficult for Botswana to be successful in counter-poaching.
So what happens as far as Botswana's government and environmental affairs departments now go forward, Ross? Because they've clearly now realized they've put, and I use the word sensitively to those who follow conservation issues closely, they've literally put themselves in the crosshairs of poachers in Botswana. What does the government and environmental affairs now do to try and get on top of this? Do they reduce elephants? Are we talking about culling elephants? Are we talking about relocation? Are we talking about redesigning the biomes? What do we do to now try and save the animal that we're trying to save?
Yeah, excellent question. And I think that the short answer is you do everything you possibly can to get the region onto the same page politically and in terms of the allocation of resources and coherence of policy. And you use your transfrontier parks as areas into which elephants can safely migrate. But that literally is where it's at. Or you can translocate elsewhere, and translocation is expensive and difficult. What you really want to do is get the region working properly so that you have intact biomes across borders so that your species is relatively well protected. And that's really where it's at. The Botswana government hasn't responded in the most appropriate way between the initial alarm raised last year in September and now. There's been some obfuscation and some denial, and that's certainly not going to help us. We need to face up to the fact that there's a problem. Obviously, they feel sensitive about this because they feel that the international world of conservation is now having a go at them and saying that, well, your policy confusion has led to this. But the truth is this has been going on for well over a year. It started under the previous administration, which had a very clear counter-poaching and elephant conservation policy. And now Masisi's administration is relatively more consultative. But some of the proposals that have been put on the table, such as a return to trophy hunting and culling, regular and limited, those are very poor ideas. There's a big debate to be had in conservation as to the role of trophy hunting. As an economist, I'm not in favor unless it's extremely well governed. And in the absence of evidence of good governance, I'm not convinced that it's a win. And of course, there are those who disagree with me. But on culling, you simply destroy herd sociology, especially if it's irregular, and that in turn is likely to destroy your tourism industry. And frankly, Botswana doesn't have much to go on besides tourism in the future beyond diamonds.
Ross, let's perhaps, as I begin to wrap up this conversation, let's talk a little bit about, you mentioned the transfrontier, you talked about transnational cooperation. Transnational and transfrontier parks work incredibly well when it comes to moving the various biodome species across the borders to bring in tourists, to bring in money, to increase the economy. Yet, oddly enough, and correct me if I'm wrong, what you don't have is a cooperation between the authorities. They're still seen as various separate sovereign forms of prosecution, forms of authority, and forms of law enforcement. There's still, all these years later, there seems to be a contradiction in how our governments in the region seem to be operating.
Yeah, absolutely, Gareth. So I'll give you a very good example. I was at the SADC Anti-Poaching and Law Enforcement Strategy Workshop in 2016. And every single country there literally disagreed from minister to minister about how to deal with elephant conservation. And the minister from Botswana, from Namibia said, look, we hunt. That's our cultural heritage. That's our right. And the Botswana Minister of Tourism, Tsikidi Kama, said, well, whose elephant is it? If the elephant wakes up in Namibia, decides it doesn't want to be poached, and comes into Botswana for safety, well, whose elephant is it actually? And he was really making the point that, look, these elephants don't belong to any particular sovereign state. They're, as you said, they're a migratory species. But it's incredibly difficult to convince sovereign nations to move onto the same page in terms of policy coherence for conservation, even though the tourism benefits to be had from such a move are enormous. In many respects, it comes down to not wanting to lose direct revenues from the policies currently in place. So hunting earns a lot of money for Namibia. They don't want to lose that. And they disagree over how to share the rents if tourism has to transnationally.
Ross, thank you so very much. And I'm sure as this, I'm going to call it what it is, it's a scourge of poaching in northern Botswana at the moment. I'm sure as this continues, sadly, you and I and many other role players are going to have a conversation about this. Ross Harvey, thank you very much indeed for your time this evening, joining us via Skype from the South African Institute for International Affairs.